Hello humans, it's your host Kory, and before we jump into this week's episode, I just wanted to let you know that my new book, A Well Cared For Human, is now available on pre-order. Depending on when you see this, it might already be available for purchase, but I wanted you to know that the book was out into the world for you. If you've been loving what we've been talking about on the podcast, please check out the book, not only because it's nicely well organized and packaged. The episodes are episodic, and so it's kind of all over the place, different topics for different weeks as they come to me, but the book is nice and organized by section and chapter and really gives you a better overview of what it's like to have an amazing relationship with yourself. But more importantly, I don't know about you, but when I read self-help books, I like to have something tangible that I can highlight or circle or dog ear and keep coming back to, keep referencing, and so that's why it was really important for me to make this book for you. I wanted you to have something in your hands that you could keep coming back to again and again as you needed. And so please check it out if that's something that you're interested in, and you'll find the links to all of that in my description box below, but you'll also be able to go to my website, awellcaredforhuman.com, and check out the links there as well. But let's jump into this week's episode. Welcome to A Well Cared For Human, the podcast that tries to convince you that you are 100% normal and an even better than okay example of the human species, despite the fact that sometimes we feel like the craziest, most incapable, or worthless creatures on the face of this planet. I'm Kory, an author, a creative, and the host of the show. Whatever you're bringing to the table today, I hope this episode proves to be a dose of inspiration for you on your quest to become a well-cared-for human. You can find the episode show notes, your free wellness blueprint, and more at awellcaredforhuman.com. And as always, thank you for listening. Hello humans, it's your host Kory, and this week we're going to talk about reactivity. And so when I say reactivity, I'm referring to the fact that many of us, when we experience something, whether it's a difficult situation or a sudden influx of a strong emotion, whatever that trigger is, there is not a lot of space between the trigger and how we react to it. So let's say someone says something and it really upsets us, and then we shout back or we react, or maybe we even try to hit them, whatever it is. That space, how small that space is, determines how reactive you are. So if you're a highly reactive person, there is real difficulty in taking that pause, that breath between when something has happened and how you decide to respond to it. And of course, we want as much control as possible over how we respond to the things that happen to us. The more we are able to delay that reaction, the more in control we feel, the more secure in ourselves, the more we can trust ourselves when we feel that we are not being controlled by our triggers or our emotional responses. And so it's really important to be able to work with that reactivity. And the thing is that I grew up in such a way that I was a very reactive person, really close to my traumatic experiences. So from my teenage years into probably mid-20s or so, I would have considered myself a very reactive person. And so that meant that if anything upset me emotionally, I would get upset very quickly. So, cry, scream, whatever my reaction to that emotion would have been. But then also, if someone had done something, I would have responded really quickly instead of maybe thinking about how I would like to respond. Also, when I had my eating disorder, so I've talked on the show before about how I developed bulimia in my 20s. And so that distance between when I felt that urge to binge or that urge to be anorexic too, because I swung to the other side as well, but that desire to do something, the space between that and when I would actually do it or complete the action was so small. So I had to work with my reactivity in order to bring it back into balance. And that can be really hard if you grew up in an environment that was itself really reactive. So I've talked about growing up with my narcissistic father, who he would be perfectly fine one moment and then explosively angry in the next breath. And so that created a lot of reactivity in me because I had to, move or react quickly. Or growing up with my mother, same, because she was bipolar, and so she would also have these really sharp mood swings. Growing up with family members who were domestically violent, and so they were very physically abusive. You had to be very reactive to them, to the situation, in order to keep yourself safe. There's also if you were in an environment with someone who was maybe using drugs or alcohol, and so they themselves would also change. They'd be very volatile, and so your reactivity in the name of keeping yourself safe, or your reactivity just simply because you were exposed to other people's reactivity. So if everyone else is being reactive, why wouldn't you be reactive, especially as a child, right? You're learning and mirroring those experiences from others. And so I was no different. I came out of that teens and 20s as a very reactive person. A lot of that, of course, connected to the trauma and my family dynamics. And so I had to unlearn my reactivity. I had to unlearn that I didn't need to immediately respond compulsively or just react to the things that happened, that I, in fact, could control my response time. But that was difficult for me to unpack. First, I didn't really recognize that I was reactive at the time. I didn't really understand what that concept of reactivity meant. But my definition of reactivity is that there's no space between emotion or experience, so maybe the danger of your violent parent, for example, and what you do in response. So they yell, you cry. They scream, you run. Like whatever it was. It's like if it's instantaneous, there's no space between trigger and action. And so to break reactivity, you have to build space between trigger and reaction. How do we do that? It took me a while. Hopefully you're not as reactive as I am as a person, and you'll get through this quicker. I don't like making people promises like, oh, just do this and it'll be changed tomorrow. I think that's disingenuous when people do that, when people who are trying to help others, they're like, oh, just do this and it'll be fine. It took you a while to learn and master reactivity. It's going to take you a while to unlearn and to do away with reactivity, and I think that's perfectly normal. The trick to that is to not beat yourself up while you're doing it. So try not to add that layer of self-judgment and self-criticism while you're working with your reactivity. But as far as creating that distance, again, between emotion and trigger, there's several things that I did to help bring that into balance. First and foremost, I started looking at ways to slow down my mind. So sometimes the emotion was triggered by myself. No one likes to admit this, but it's true. So sometimes it wasn't always another person who made me upset. So for example, taking the bulimia, there wasn't like a cake that was actually assaulting me, right? It was just my own emotional landscape that created that reaction. And so it helped me to work with my own mind, my own emotions. And the first thing I had to develop in order to do that was awareness. So you can't realize you're about to react or that you're feeling that cascade of physical signs. So for me, in the case of the binging, for example, my heart rate would go up, or I'd start to feel really tense, or I'd feel that urge, that craving. You can't recognize those signs or those symptoms in your body unless you're paying attention. And how do we pay attention? With awareness. So anything you can do to build awareness that you're reacting, like realize, oh, I'm getting really angry, or oh, I'm getting really upset. Being able to recognize that, called awareness. Now, things that I did to raise my awareness was, of course, meditation, learning to sit still, which was really hard for me. I'm not a very still person by nature, at least it doesn't feel that way. Now I'm pretty good at it, but it's taken a long time for me to get there. But creating stillness by sitting, by breathing, by doing body scans, which means that I just focus on one part of my body at a time and then relaxing each part in turn. So for example, if I want to become more aware of my body and the changes, I can help myself to be more physically present with my body. So for example, I could put my hand, you can't see my foot. You can't see my foot, but I can. Put my hand on my foot, and I feel my foot, and then I just recognize, I am touching my foot. This is my foot, I am touching it. Then moving up, this is my ankle, I am touching it. This is my leg, I am touching it. And it sounds silly. I mean, I felt really stupid personally when I started with this. I was like, what is this going to do? What is this going to teach me? How is this going to help me get over my family's violent and explosive past? Zero comprehension of the connection. But what it's doing is it's forcing you to pay attention. It's forcing you to focus. It's forcing you to check in. It's forcing you to take things step by step, which are all things we don't do when we're in toxic family situations, and not just families. I use my family because that's most of my experience, but also if you're in a relationship, if you've had ever toxic relationships or toxic friendships or anything else, we're not paying attention to ourselves. Even if you're just in a toxic work environment, busy reacting to your boss's demands or your coworkers' demands or your customers. And so that also, same sense, if you're so busy reacting, you're not checking in, you're not paying attention, you're not connecting. And so it does feel silly, but it's absolutely important to learn the skill, learn how to slow down amidst the chaos. And so body scans, one little bit at a time. This is my knee and I am touching it. What does that feel like? Just staying present, moving up. So body scans, breathing. I talk about in my book, A Well Cared For Human, the box breathing. That's helped me to stabilize my mind and build awareness quite a bit. So you hold 4 counts on one side. So imagine a box. You breathe in 4 counts, you hold for 4 counts, you exhale for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts. So you're drawing that square, that box in your mind. So helping you to focus, again, to sit with something, to stay with something. That's just small little visualization, which is drawing this box in your mind. That helps. And then also just finding other ways to be aware and present throughout the day. And so I like to do what's called a check-in. So I'm just doing something, and I got this idea from Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was a Buddhist monk. He has since passed, and he lived in this monastery called Plum Village, and they had a bell there, and whenever the bell would ring, everyone in the monastery would just stop and listen to this bell. And so I do something similar throughout my day. Obviously, there's not bells ringing. Well, sometimes there's a church like, I don't know, a few blocks over that way, and I can hear their bells sometimes. So yeah, they are bells, but not in my mind, fortunately. But anytime I think about it through the day, I just stop and I listen to my environment and I just say, what do I hear? Do I hear the wind? Do I hear birds? Do I hear my dog probably licking his paws and driving me crazy? Whatever I hear, just check in with that and recognize that. And that brings me back to the present. And again, all we're doing here is we're learning how to be present, how to be aware. Because the higher that awareness is, the more likely you're going to be to catch that reactivity at its very beginning. And now, why is that important to catch the reactivity at the beginning? Because it's so much easier to stop it in its tracks when it's that small. I don't know if you've ever told yourself a story in your mind. In my book, I use the example of cleaning. So I get very mad when my wife is messy. I've made no secrets that she's a messy person. I am not. And so if I'm cleaning up after her, I will start being perfectly fine, thinking it's not a big deal. It's just some dishes or whatever. Just wash them. But by the time I'm done, I'm so mad at her because that whole time I've been telling myself a story. I've been creating story and I've been building that emotion. I've been making it stronger. Reactivity is the same way in that in the beginning, it's really easy. I don't want to say really easy because sometimes the emotions are so strong, but it's easier to catch it when it first comes out than to give it a chance to really settle in or to get really big. And so thinking of ways to catch it sooner is basically all tied to awareness. Anything that you would come up with, how I'm going to be able to do this, I'm going to try this and make sure that when this person looks like this and I know they're about to yell at me, I'm going to be this. All of that is awareness. So anything you would do to help reduce your reactivity would start with awareness. So think about those awareness building activities that you can do. The meditation, the focus, the paying attention, the checking in, coming back to the present, bringing yourself back to the present. All of that will help you to catch things early. And even if you don't catch it right away, as many of us don't, I did not and still don't sometimes, if you can have that awareness later on, so even let's say you're halfway through the making yourself furious, you're like, here I am. That awareness will still serve you further down the line through the development of this reactivity. And so you still being able to catch it, that's still important. So awareness is good, hands down. So ask yourself, what are you doing right now to build your awareness that would help you with this reactivity? Now, in addition to being aware, you have to figure out how to slow things down, because when the trigger happens and we act, if that space is really small, it's very fast. That's part of the problem, is that it feels so fast. I smelled a cake and now I'm eating it and trying to find a place to throw up, right? Like, oh my gosh, why did that happen so quickly? Or this person came into this room, I was so upset, immediately I'm screaming at them. How did I get there so quickly? How did I go from mildly irritated to screaming? The second thing to consider is the speed. How are you going to slow down the speed between trigger and reaction? And so one of the things that are so shocking or so, I guess, makes it unmanageable, these working with triggers, the reactivity, is that when something happens and then the moment that we react to that something is so fast, it just instantaneous. You went from mildly irritated, maybe not even aware you were irritated, so now you're screaming at someone. And it's like, that happened in half a second. Like, how did that happen? And so anything you can do to slow down the space between those two will help you to have more control over yourself and your reactions. And so things that I do to slow down the space. One is to be like a log, and that's also a Buddhist teaching, this idea that you just imagine that you are a log in the forest doing absolutely nothing. For me, it's also just and I'm sure that's not very flattering on the camera, me here giving myself a double chin. But this idea that you can't react if you freeze up. And that's different than if you're in a trauma response and something terrible happens and you freeze. That's a different problem. We're not talking about that. We're talking about if your normal reaction is to fight, for example, your normal action is to make the situation worse somehow, instead of reacting from that place. Or even if you catch yourself, so you open your mouth and you're starting to complain a little bit, and then you're like, just lock yourself down. Just be like a log and just sit with yourself. Now, this is harder if there's someone else involved and they're making your situation worse, right? So you realize that you're angry, you want to scream, you're upset, you're trying to be less reactive, and so you shut yourself down. But now here's this person running their mouth and you're like, and so it might be better to remove yourself from the situation and then go into your log shape, your log form, if the situation is more like that. And I guess I should have started with all of this. Clearly is not going to work if you're still in the toxic relationships, the dangerous dynamics. If you are in a abusive relationship, obviously you're not going to become like a log when they start screaming at you, because that's dangerous, right? They could physically hurt you, they could do something to you. That's not going to work. You have to remove yourselves from the presence of the toxic people, the dangerous situations first. Please remember that. But the idea of how do you work with the reactivity after you're out of the terrible environments, because that was the case with my family, right? Like, I escaped my family. So I had moved out, I had moved on, I was now living on my own in my late teens, early 20s, but I was still dealing with a lot of these strong, difficult emotions just in my daily life, because it was what I was taught. It was how the people around me behaved. It was conditioned in me because it was so unsafe and so volatile growing up that I had to be reactive in order to be safe. But I didn't want to continue those habits, right? Because it was making me miserable. It was making me feel out of control. It was making me not feel great in any kind of capacity. And so I needed to address it. And so once I was in that safer environment, that's when I could start working with reactivity. So get yourself safe first. Look at building awareness so you can catch yourself. Then look at slowing things down by being a log, by breathing, by waiting it out. There was definitely a time where I had issues with explosive anger myself. I was just a very angry person. That part of you, and when you hear that anger is that part of you that knows that you were mistreated and is furious about it, there was definitely a big part of me that knew that I was mistreated by my family and was furious about it. And so I was a very angry person for a while. Sitting with that anger, I just had to learn to sit there and kind of let it burn me alive. Which is as terrible as it sounds. I won't lie to you. I won't sugarcoat it and make it say, oh, it's fine, you'll get over it. I did have to sit there and want to burn the house down. But at the same time, knowing that emotions only have a shelf life of about 90 seconds. When I was really mad, about 3 minutes, double that. But the idea is that as long as I'm not telling myself a story like, oh, those terrible people, or I'm not feeding it in some way and getting myself upset more and more, if I can just sit with the feelings. And if you're having issues with narratives as well, all of this still applies, building the space and working with that. What you do is you still sit. So when you feel yourself telling your story, you're just like, no, I'm not doing it. and you just become like a log. And then when you start telling yourself a story again, because you will, because we're all compulsive and repetitive in that way, be like, nope, keep coming back. And it becomes a meditation. Just keep coming back to the, nope, I'm not feeding that. I'm not doing it. No. Until you get to the point where it's creating more and more of that space and that distance. And so that's how I personally did it, not just with my bulimia, but also my emotional reactivity. I would get upset very easily by things I didn't always know how to interpret people's actions. When you grow up in a really abusive environment and then you encounter just normal confrontations with people, like normal, like this person and this person just doesn't get along or something, or there's a miscommunication, my reaction to that would be so strong because I was used to being in such a dangerous situation that I thought that this was a bigger deal than it was. And so my reactions were out of place. Learning how to tone those things down involved sitting with myself more, just not believing in the storyline necessarily, not believing that if I don't do something immediately, something terrible is going to happen to me. That's simply not true. And so for that reason, there's this connection between understanding when you're safe and understanding when you're not safe. And so growing up in a really volatile environment, you don't always know if you're actually safe. And so even though I had escaped my family and no one was beating up on me, no one was throwing beer bottles anymore, no one was doing any of these dangerous things that I had countered in the past, I still didn't know if I was entirely safe with people. And that's just a feeling of existing with others. If you don't trust others and you don't trust yourself with others, you can have a hard time trying to determine, like, am I safe with this person? Is it okay? And so that reactivity can still be there because you're still trying to get a feel. You're still trying to check things out. And so all of the same techniques apply: building awareness, slowing things down, sitting with yourself, knowing that it's safe to not act immediately, that nothing will happen if you don't do something about that right now. Because that was also kind of the feeling I had. Again, a residual replication, I guess we could say, of what I had experienced in childhood, which is if I did not react immediately in that dangerous environment, something bad would happen. But now I was an adult in situations that were uncomfortable, but it didn't require an immediate response from me. Nothing bad was going to happen if I took a breath, if I paused. And so giving myself permission to just wait with that, to just give myself a second. Do I need to tell you the power of giving yourself a second, like the permission to give yourself a second? I feel like a lot of us don't have permission to take a break, to take a pause, to breathe, to just wait. I'll get back to you on that. And maybe you need some sayings for yourself as well. If you're in a work situation, for example, and everyone's expecting you to immediately, maybe you need to have a saying that you can just trot out whenever these people are pressuring you for things and you're like, I don't want to be reactive, so I'm going to take a minute to think about how I want to consciously choose to react to this. And so I'm going to need to get back to you on that. I'm going to need the moment with that. And if people press you, if they force a reaction out of you, it kind of says more about them and how they respect you as a person. Do they really love and respect you? Or, I mean, if we're talking coworkers, they don't have to love you, but do they respect you if they can't give you a second to think about it? Like, I don't think that they do. And so even in your personal relationships, if someone can't give you a moment to think about that, if they can't give you, even just 5 minutes to sit with something, I don't know if they love you and have your best interest at heart. And so we definitely want the people in our lives who do love us and who do have our best interests at heart. And there's no shame in asking for more time to deal with something. And there was a little bit of period there where I thought if I took too much time, maybe I would seem dumb. Like if I needed to wait on something, maybe it would be like I was too stupid to make a quick decision. But where did that come from? Obviously from my narcissistic father, who was always trying to convince me that I'm a big old dummy. But the idea that you can't take a moment to think about it, of course you can. Smart people take time to think about things all the time. They don't have to react immediately. They consider things deeply and passionately, a lot of them. And so you don't need to be reactive. So don't accept pressure from external sources telling you you need to immediately do something. Don't give power to people who don't deserve to have power over you, who will make this reactivity in you worse because they're kind of forcing you to do something that maybe you're not ready to do. Add a bit of consciousness. This is, again, connected to the awareness. Like if you're aware that something is a problem, then you can work to slow things down. But then when you get to the point to where you want to act, then make a conscious choice. Like, I want to react in this way. So what does this all look like together? Well, think about the example of anger. As a child, growing up, teenager, into my early 20s, had a lot of anger, was mistreated and abused, and so I was very reactive in that way. And so I know that anger can be triggered in me by certain things. So now I'm an adult, I'm not in the abusive situation anymore, but someone has said something insulting or they've intentionally tried to harm me, and I am, pissed. I'm angry about it. And so what do I do with that? First of all, if I've built enough awareness, I'll realize, I am getting mad. That has upset me. And then when I recognize that, I can start taking the actions to try to slow it down. Because I know in my mind, if I let it build up, if I let it get it too big, explosive, I'm not going to be able to control it, right? So immediately start doing the things I know that slow it down. Start breathing. Start getting back into my body, start scanning, start checking, start listening to things in the distance. Do I hear birds? Do I hear trains? Anything to slow the moment down so that I don't immediately react. And then secondly, get to a point where I decide consciously what I'm going to do next. So not just I'm deciding I'm going to smack them across the face, which, maybe you get there and that's exactly what you want to decide. But more with a bit of self-control, getting to that moment and deciding, I don't want to be the kind of person that just reacts badly and slaps someone else. We were all uncomfortable watching Chris Rock get slapped, for example, at least I was. And so the idea that you don't want to be that kind of person that reacts in that way to other people also. So it's like, okay, I don't want to be that person. So I'm going to consciously choose how I want to react. And so I'm going to tell this person, you should not speak to me that way and you're not allowed to, and I don't think we should see each other anymore. However I want to react, whatever a reaction that I feel is appropriate, because it isn't that you have to become a doormat. If you have a lot of anger, you're right to have anger. If someone mistreats you, of course, why not be angry? And so it's different, though, to react from a place where you're not really in control. You're just doing whatever it is that comes to you instinctually rather than consciously deciding, you know what, I don't like that interaction and I don't think maybe we have a good relationship or that you deserve to have a place in my life. And so making a conscious decision, that's different. You're still feeling angry. Like, I could still be absolutely livid when that's happening. I'm thinking specifically of an encounter I had at a dog park lately. Recently, there was a person there whose dog was not controlled and he was very misbehaved and he tried to hurt Max, this dog. And I was very furious about it because I felt that the owner did not handle the situation well. They tried to brush off their dog's terrible behavior. Like, oh, they're fine, they're just being dogs. Like, no, your dog grabbed my dog. Like, this is not being. And so I was very upset about it. And so I just was very direct and very blunt. I wasn't screaming, I wasn't yelling, but I mean, it wasn't like I was not mad. Like, I was clearly pissed off, but I was deciding consciously how I wanted to react to that person. Now, all of this is the ideal situation, right? There's still going to be times when the reaction, maybe if your fear, for example, is really intense, or any of these strong emotions, you're still going to go from whatever happened to reaction like that. And there's nothing you're going to be able to do about that. So also bring a bit of self-forgiveness to the situation. I feel like that's important. You're not always going to get it right, even with your best intentions. Even if 9 out of 10 times you recognize you're getting upset, you're able to slow things down and then make a conscious decision. Awesome. The times that you don't do that, forgive yourself. You were trying. A majority of people out there are not trying to be aware, slow it down, and make conscious decisions. So the fact that you're even trying to get your reactivity under control, give yourself a bit of grace there. And when you do react in a way that you're not proud of, if there's a way to apologize or to make amends, if you feel like you went too far, by all means, do it. Do what you can. If there's consequences, like now that person doesn't want to be your friend, or now you don't have a favorable position with this coworker, whatever it is, accept it. Does not mean you're a bad person because you made a mistake. It just simply means that you made a mistake. And so let that motivate you going forward to keep trying to do your best. And so self-forgiveness is definitely still a part of this whole overcoming reactivity. Because if you're beating yourself up again, going back to that foundation of well-being I've talked about many times, how you think about yourself, how you talk to yourself, and how you act toward yourself. If you're beating yourself up for the mistakes you make because of your reactivity, that's not very kind, is it? And so don't do that to yourself. Don't add that layer of complication. Just keep doing your best to become aware that you're reacting, that you're feeling something, slowing the situation down as much as you can with breathing, getting present, dropping down into your body, taking a break, walking away from someone if you have to, whatever you've got to do, and then consciously making a decision about how do you want to react to this. What kind of person do you want to be in these situations? Like, imagine the coolest person you could think of. What do they do when they're angry? What do they do when they're scared? What do they do when X, Y, or Z happens? And then emulate those actions until they become natural to you, until that is your natural reaction. This happens and you act like that, which is what will occur if you do it enough. So just keep practicing and forgive yourself when you make mistakes. And that's the best advice I can have on working with emotional reactivity. And again, just be really patient. It takes time to undo it. You didn't learn it in a day, and you're not going to unlearn it in a day. So be really patient and just know that with time, you will build better habits when it comes to reactivity. And that's it for today, dear human. As always, I hope you found this episode useful. And if you did and you would like to write into the show and ask me about anything that you're dealing with, I would love to hear from you guys through any of my social media or through Kory at KoryMstrom.com. And I could feature your questions on a future episode. Otherwise, I will be back next week with another episode of A Well Cared For Human. And until then, please take good care of you. This episode of A Well Cared For Human was written and produced by me, Kory Marie. The music was by Late Night Feeler and Esther Abrami. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider visiting my Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to the episodes, as well as a monthly patrons-only Q&A, bonus videos, and more. Not to mention that your Patreon support lets me know that you find value in the show and want it to continue. You can find me on Patreon by visiting www.patreon.com/Kory Marie. If you can't support the show financially, that is okay. You can still subscribe to the show, leave a review of the show, and recommend the show to your friends, not just the neurotic ones. All of this helps so much. And as always, thank you for listening.